Good day to you. Here is a drum that I bought when I was in Ghana, Africa. I don't play the drum, but I wanted to bring this home. And what I didn't really realize when I bought this drum is this is not just a musical instrument, but it actually is a way that Ghanaians communicated in the past between villages where there was no radio or TV. That's how they would communicate, at least at a certain, I guess you could say, semi-primitive level. We're coming tonight. We're hungry. The drum was used as a communication device. Here is, I'm not really sure how to describe this artwork. It's black ink pen, and it was created by a Chinese student who assisted a class that I taught in China, and this student was an art major there. And the level of detail is what blows me away in these drawings, as well as the overall concept of them. And I think that that's very similar to me anyhow, at least at one level, to the Chinese characters that you have to master to be able to draw. You need to be able to have so much of a sophisticated control of the pen or the pencil that you're using to draw things in China, including the artwork behind me and letters. It's a way of Chinese people expressing themselves that we just don't have here in the United States. So it's with these two examples, the drum from Ghana and the Chinese artwork, that I introduced today's class. It's the back end of the chapter on media content. We're going to take on the 4 remaining countries, including China, including Ghana, but also Mexico as well. And I just wanted to give a little flavor of culture, in essence, to remind ourselves that when you see media content, the crescendo of the class, which is what we're at now, there's so many elements underneath it that have come to play in a media system to give rise to that content. The content doesn't just rise up miraculously or coincidentally or randomly. It rises up because of financing and philosophies and culture, like Ghana and China. So to start with Mexico for media content, we can say that their newspapers are extremely political. Most of the news in there, at least in the broadsheets, is political news. It's about political parties and what they're advocating for. It's about politicians that are arguing with each other. It's about political ideas that could be put into law. There's a lot of discussion of politics at all different levels, state, local, national, government, in Mexican newspapers. But then they also have these tabloids that are extremely graphic in showing blood and in showing the devastation to human suffering that's been caused by the drug cartels in particular there. Now, it's an interesting conundrum for Mexican reporters because they are allowed to report on Mexican cartels and murders, especially territorial hits where people have been taken out, but they're not allowed to report names of drug cartel members. That's when you get the phone call from the drug cartel saying, hey, we know that your daughter is getting her driver's license soon. Click. And the threat and the intimidation is clear. I don't want to paint Mexico in a way that you probably already have a fear of it over being, that it is a widespread gangster land between these drug cartels. It's not. It's mostly between Mexico and its northern neighbor, the United States, where the drug cartel turf wars take place. And the vast majority of Mexico, including the place that we go to very many times, Mazatlan, Mexico, on the Pacific side, is very peaceful, very calm, very soothing, actually. It's tough to believe the Mexico that gets portrayed. Anyway, back to Mexican media. We can say that content on radio is a lot like the United States in terms of the look and the feel. Not really the look, but the feel of radio, the pacing of it, the commercials. It just kind of sounds American. However, you do have a lot of Mexican radio that is airing Mexican musical genres. There's a lot of musical genres in Mexico. Mexico's a very musical country. Most people play musical instruments, so you hear music that's formed around horn sections, you hear it formed around acoustic guitar, you hear it formed around vocalists, you hear it formed around all kinds of musical instruments in Mexico, and that makes its way into radio genres with ranchera music or banda music or norte music. These are all genres of Mexican radio. And then finally, to wrap up Mexico, probably the most distinctive item on its television, that is to say TV content, is the telenovela. The telenovela, or telenovel, is similar to our soap opera in the United States, but also it's very, very different. The telenovela has as its premise that it's only going to run for 6 months. and then it's going to turn over, and all of the actors on that drama will go to another drama and play different roles. And so that's one very big difference between the American soap opera like Days of Our Lives and the Mexican telenovela. The American soap opera, females I've talked to, I've often said, I can miss years and years of episodes and then just watch one episode and I'm all caught up, because it's very formulaic and because a lot of the characters are repeating cycles of behaviors, making it easy to get access to, and so you can miss it for a couple of years and come back. It's a different idea than the telenovela. In the telenovela, you have good and evil. You have the black-hatted people, and you have the people who are the white-hatted people. And you also have class divisions in the telenovela. Normally there's a conflict presented. It's a romantic conflict between a male who comes from a well-to-do family versus a female who's very working class, perhaps has some indigenous Mexican in her. She's looking a lot browner in her skin, looks more like an indigenous American, an indigenous Mexican. Usually there's a kind of a love clash that's created between those classes, or they flip it. The female is the one who has the higher class standing and the male is the poorer one. That's a very common premise of the Mexican telenovela. Mexican telenovelas are so famous across the world. They have a very dramatic feel to them. They're riveting to watch visually, I have to say. I don't speak Spanish well enough to really stay with one the whole way through, but I've tried, and it's amazing, really, the drama that they're able to create within the television medium. And they're watched all over the world, including Russia. Moving on to China now. China, when we talk about newspapers, has the party newspapers. These are newspapers that are extensions of the Communist Party. They're printed by the party. They're delivered by the party. They're put up in those viewing frames on the sides of buildings by the party. It's talking about what the Communist Party is doing to improve water irrigation, to improve health safety standards, to develop this region of China, to improve the economy, to improve home ownership. A lot of the same things that we're considering in the U.S., those newspapers are covering, but it just happens to be with the point of view that the communist government's approach is the correct approach. You also, though, have tabloids in China. You may be surprised to find these tabloids are allowed to go after drug problems, crime, some violence. These papers are allowed to cover that, to try and sort of expose it in the big cities. The idea is, within the communist ideology, that people will see that that way of life is not the way of life that you would want to choose. And so there's a better way. So the better way is to follow a lot of the ideology that's talked about by the Communist Party in terms of the way that people should treat each other civilly and to be polite and obedient. It's a very big part of Chinese culture. Okay, getting a little out of range here, but the idea is that the tabloid newspapers are allowed to offer the seedy side of China, but it's within a context of serving a larger purpose. Also in China, they have the fitness TV program. I can tell you I witnessed kind of that myself firsthand. One day I was in the dormitory in China, and I all of a sudden heard this voice. It sounded very militaristic. It was a female. Hoo, ha, hoo, hoo, hoo. That's about the best that I can remember, but I left my dorm room to go see what it was, and as I walked across campus, I saw speakers by the sidewalk. And I thought, what is this? Is this Chinese communist propaganda? That must be what it is. That must be how they propagandize. Well, I went back to the dorm and I talked to the people at the front desk, and they told me, no, that's the exercise lady. She's getting you to do sit-ups. She's getting you to do calisthenics. So this is something that is also speaking to the communist ideology, because the communist ideology is very much about the government having a role in the fitness of a human being. And so this is a government sponsored, government regulated, government allowed lady who's speaking to millions and millions of people, and they do it on television, they do it on loudspeakers apparently at my university. A very interesting dimension of China. Another area of content that China is very distinct on is the melody drama. Similar to how the telenovela was very, very unique for Mexico, the melody drama in China is very unique. The melody drama is I guess you could look at it as a kind of a pop opera, but not really pop in the sense that we think of. It's a kind of modern music, but it also has classical themes to it, and with really elaborate costuming. And there's always these epic struggles that are going on between families. Again, often it's a romance between a female and a male, but it's not presented with a seedy side to it. It's about ideals of love and about the ideals of fidelity to family, commitment to family. The melody opera is a pageantry. It's a pageantry of beautiful sequin, satin clothing, and people acting with their arms like they would in an opera, for people far away to see them. It's a spectacular thing to see a melody drama. Finally, before we leave China, we do want to mention that out of the countries that we're studying today, it is the one where the internet is censored. There's a whole division of government that's assigned to be the Internet Security Police. It reports within the Ministry of Propaganda. And you cannot get Facebook in China, and you cannot agitate against the government. You're being watched on the internet. It's very, very censored in China, as we would expect. Moving on to Ghana now. In Ghana, most of the newspapers there can be characterized as serious. They're very about serious issues. You don't have too much in the way of entertainment. Country's not really wealthy enough to have a big entertainment sector, but a lot of serious issues, getting the country together, overcoming poverty, overcoming lack of investment, building an economy that can sustain bad times with agriculture and climate. These are things that Ghana's just trying to struggle to do like every developing country. So a lot of the newspapers are very serious, dealing with the issues as the politicians see them, trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the politicians. It's the first time that Ghana has had a long run of democracy. Only since the year 2000 have they had this democracy. It's only 16 years old. So there's a lot of hope and confidence in government officials being able to be elected and make decisions. The tabloids are characterized by poor quality. I remember holding them in my hands. The ink is coming off. The paper's very thin. Sometimes the print is blurry. The photographs aren't always clear. They may have gotten better since I was there. That was about 6 years ago. But that struck me as something that is indicative of a developing country. The most prominent newspaper there, I think, should be mentioned in this video, the Daily Graphic, because the Daily Graphic was actually a government newspaper. It goes back to the idea of a developing media philosophy where the only way for a newspaper to get started sometimes, or TV station or radio station, is for the government to help it by financing it, by providing expertise and know-how and clearance and regulation and laws. So the government actually owned the newspaper, the Daily Graphic, in Ghana before it moved over to become a not government-funded newspaper anymore, but still friendly to government. But it is a public newspaper that has its own independence. I also want to mention that it's very common, at least when I was there, to see reactions in newspapers, in newspaper stories, reactions from chiefs. That would be tribal chiefs. Ghana is still, I don't want to describe it as not being, quote, civilized and just villages. It does have a big town of Accra and Kumasami. I can't remember the town just to the north of that. Kumasi? No, it's not it either. Anyway, two big cities, but then there are these villages. And within these villages, you have tribal conditions. Some of them don't have electricity. Some of them don't have roads. Some of them exist unto themselves, no schooling system, etc. So you do have that present in Ghana, and that's why chief reactions to initiatives by the government are important. You can see a photo of one of those in the book. And again, this is a chapter where you should be looking at all the photos. It's the best chapter for photos, media content. And there's a photo of a Ghana chief chiming in on whether porta potties are going to work in his village. The government's trying to get people to use porta potties instead of going to the bathroom on the beach, to put it very, very bluntly. So that's the kind of thing that you see in Ghana. Not that all or even most of Ghana is like that, but the fact that it exists makes it worth interesting to talk about. As we've mentioned before, radio in Ghana is the most important medium. It's the one that reaches the most people. It's one that most people feel confident with the way that they communicate, because there's this orality has such a big place in the way that Ghanaians communicate. And their radio is very often talk radio, very often educational talk radio. People talking is very cheap kind of programming. And people are wanting to voice opinions. A lot of it's politics. A lot of the radio is educational. It's used by the government to try and educate tribal people into modern day ways of living, like how to clean your hair, how to use underarm deodorant, how to protect against AIDS, how to basically have body hygiene. They use radio for that in Ghana. And the music that you hear, I just want to make a note to you here, is sounds very Caribbean in a lot of ways. It's got that same similar beat as a reggae sound to that you would find in Jamaica and other Caribbean countries, which you would expect because of this early slave triangle that we talked about in the globalization chapter that carried slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, and that music went with them, and now it returns from the Caribbean to Ghana as well. They have their own sort of, I guess you could say, mini colonization that went on and a cultural exchange as a result of that. And the final thing I'm going to mention about Ghanaian TV, it's very low grade, not much money to produce TV content. Most radio TV stations struggle to produce their own local content. It's very expensive to do that in television, so they often purchase content from other countries, and one of those is Nigeria. Remember, if you will, Ghana is surrounded by 3 French-speaking countries, whereas Ghana's English is surrounded by the Ivory Coast, for example. That's French-speaking. So you have to go to Nigeria as the next biggest English-speaking country, and Nigeria is kind of like a bigger brother to Ghana in that way. Supplies music videos, a lot of the content that comes over from Nigeria is music videos, but also just English-speaking television in general. Moving on now to our last country of Lebanon. In Lebanon, I want to point out that the newspapers are in Arabic, which means cursive writing. There are no block letters for Arabic as a language when you write it out. And so think about what that means for a printing press in a newsroom. It's very difficult to be able to print out sentences and paragraphs where you have to juggle the letters all around like that and print a new page and go to the next page. That's what the Gutenberg printing press did. But with Arabic, with cursive, you don't have block letters, so that the end of an E ends lower than where the top of an R begins. If you know what I'm saying, it's very difficult to create a printing press to print cursive Arabic in a newspaper. Just think about that, how the nature of the way that the language is written is actually diminishing the return, diminishing the ability of that newspaper to be produced fast enough to get to a larger number of people. Pretty amazing. In Lebanon, a lot of the newspapers there are very political, very special political. They have many different factions of parties. Like we just generally tend to think we have conservatives and we have liberals or Republicans and Democrats. The other parties are usually 5% or less, and we'll find out if that's the case today during the presidential election. But we tend to think in terms of binary politics here. This or that is what we have. In Lebanon, there's like 10 different slices of conservatism and liberalism and theology, and so that is reflected in the specificity of the content in the newspapers there as well, which makes most newspapers out of reach for getting a bigger audience, because unless you have that very specific interest in that particular political ideology, you're not interested in that newspaper. On radio in Lebanon, you hear a lot of foreign language programming, which is not surprising because we already know that foreign countries actually own radio stations in Lebanon, like the BBC. And so you have programming that is bringing forth what they do the best, and that's where they are originating from, their own country. The BBC is English language programming. But we also know that Lebanon has a kind of a look upwards towards those cultures that used to occupy it. And if you speak French in a Lebanese household, you're displaying a high status, a status that's desirable in Lebanon. So having French-speaking stations in Lebanon is something that's catering to those people who consider themselves in that class. But that also means you do have some radio stations in Lebanon doing 3-language programming. They're doing French, Spanish, and English. French, English, and Arabic. 3-language programming. Some of the hosts do talk in Arabic, some do French. So think about what kind of person that very specialty programming is appealing to. A very educated person, very international person. A lot of the TV that you see is political satire TV in Lebanon. It's making fun of politicians. It's lampooning them. It's caricaturing them. It's dressing up your hand with a sock puppet and making it out to be the prime minister, or making it out to be a leader of parliament. It's doing the same thing on TV shows, overly dressing people as caricatures of the politicians they embody. Kind of like what we'd see with Saturday Night Live doing to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but to a much more extreme sense in terms of the visual appearance of people. Bigger noses, bigger eyes, bigger hats, bigger everything to make the caricature more pronounced. And then finally, in Lebanese TV, the feature that stands out is the poor foreign imitation. That means taking a show, trying to copy its format, like say it's the Big Bang Theory, and the format is basically revolving around a bunch of people sitting and using the appearance of intelligence to create situations of irony that are funny. So Lebanon will take a theme like that, and then they'll produce it with their own actors, and so it's always a copy, and imitation appears to be cheap. All right, so as I finish this class today, there's some really big issues that have come out in the content. We are studying the biggest area of the media system, the biggest element, that's media content. We've looked at how some countries have more visuals in the newspapers than others. We've looked at how the quality of print can be poor in some countries and better in others. We've looked at how advertising is more prevalent in some countries, not in others, in part because it's regulated, or in part because there just is no market to sell space to people because there isn't the wealth to be able to make the purchase of the products. So advertising has those dimensions to it. We've looked at private versus public media. In some countries, you have media that are funded by the government one way or another, and they are public media, and they produce public content. And we have others that are private, they're money makers or profit makers. And then also going along that, we have some that are commercial stations and others that are non-commercial. And it gets a little bit confusing because a public station in France can be commercial, or is commercial, I should say. So those are two different ways of dividing up kind of a similar attribute, public versus private, commercial versus non-commercial. Then we've got content that's sort of in the cultural educational realm versus the entertainment realm. And we know that in the US, we're very, very heavy on entertainment. In Europe, we see more programming dedicated to documentaries, to education, to culture. Not always these, what we consider to be very stodgy, stiff, very formal programs. Some of them very, very biting, very realistic, going into the depth of culture to track how ordinary people live their lives with ordinary things happen, with extraordinary things happening to them. That's what you see in the documentary in Europe. But on the entertainment side, this article here in the Pocono Record illustrates how entertainment pervades almost every dimension of American media content, including the news. This article is on ABC and NBC, and it's talking specifically about their evening news programs. And for years, NBC used to dominate the 6:30 TV news ratings, used to dominate over CBS and ABC. And then when cable came on the scene, the networks lost these huge audiences to where they're now just combined reaching about 22 million people in the United States every single evening. That's CBS, ABC, NBC. Well, as I said, NBC was the king for years, and suddenly ABC has inched up past NBC. And this is a huge cataclysmic event in the TV ratings world, because that nightly coveted news spot of very well educated people in the audience, of people who are idea makers and gatekeepers of opinions that they spread to other people in their lives, those people are watching those news programs, the 22, 23 million people, however many they are. So just a couple points in the ratings means so many millions of dollars in advertising revenue either lost or gained for either ABC or NBC. And so it's really about getting the biggest audience possible. It's not really about the news and the integrity of the news. It's not about whether the news is uplifting or not. It's not about whether the news is accurate. All of those, of course, don't get me wrong, they matter. In broadcast journalism as a discipline and a field, they matter. But the ultimate goal of those two networks is to accumulate the biggest audience, and that's through entertainment. So that's how I bring up the idea of entertainment to close out our lecture today. I hope I've given you some things to think about. Have a great day.